Hey guys, how's it going? I'm Duke of Italy, favorite lo-fi music YouTuber, and welcome to October. We're made in October. I already had a video out in October, but it doesn't count because today is the actual start of the October content. It's over halfway through October. I meant to have this video out a few days ago, but of which there was supposed to be a part one of a few weeks ago. But instead, we're doing part one and part two in one video, so you have a complete and comprehensive guide to what I'm about to talk to you guys about. And you're probably thinking, Duke, what are you talking to us about today? That would be Dungeon Synth, the incredible nerdy genre that we're going to dive through, which most people know through the RuneScape soundtrack, but that's about it. But if you're me, you probably know it through like black metal artists. And I'm going to tell you guys straight up, this chart right here has very little connection to black metal, except a mentioning of Wong Raven and Burzum. Burzum, of course, having some Dungeon Synth releases in the 90s and some more in the waning years of Varg's career, I guess you could say. But other than that, not a lot of mentionings, except, of course, Mortiis, who's known as like probably the biggest Dungeon Synth artist out there, which even then, a lot more of his like industrial rock material or synth pop stuff is seen as a bit more popular. But before I do anything, I'm going to read you a foreword from the chart itself, and I'm reading this from my phone here. It says, "This is the complete mutant's introduction to Dungeon Synth." What is Dungeon Synth? It says, Dungeon Synth is atmospheric, dark ambient music done primarily with keyboards and synthesizers. The themes are usually based around fantasy, paganism, and ancient medieval times. That's a bit of an oxymoron. Ancient does not mean medieval. Those are different time periods. There is often a noticeably lo-fi quality to the sound, usually in the form of vintage synthesizer patches. Where can I find Dungeon Synth? All of the new releases can be bought through Bandcamp, while the old releases can be found quite easily through Google. Out of the classics, the two Burzum albums should be easiest to find. So, sounds pretty comprehensive already. And after diving through the chart, I can honestly say, I'm kind of split on whether or not it's comprehensive, because there is no mentioning of Fief or Forgotten Pathways, and probably a couple other influential Dungeon Synth artists. And I've seen charts that have like selected Bandcamp releases or selected whatever releases, or just extra things that don't quite fall into a category that they still want to recommend for feeling either essential or great, which I totally understand. But the thing is with this chart, it's not ironclad. Not everything on here is perfect. And this chart is also divided into two sections, classics and newer releases, which there is not that much of a distinction between the styles of the classics and the newer releases, except I would probably argue the newer releases feel a bit more experimental. You're going to see elements of like drone, a lot more like chiptune, like little modifications they do here and there that are actually pretty interesting, but we'll get into that in a sec. So first of all, the first album we're mentioning, and definitely alluding to the quality of this chart not being perfect, is Mortiis' third album. No, I'm not going to try to pronounce it. But first thing I'm going to say, that album cover is sick. I love the wizard dude sort of like reaching out for whatever. The green color is great. Kind of reminds me of that one Summoning record. So all green flags so far. One weird thing is this is Mortiis' third album, of which on this chart you have other Mortiis records. This would be in the middle of discography for at least his Dungeon Synth material. So having this first doesn't make a whole lot of sense. You could have his other stuff. And even in terms of only having 3 releases from Mortiis, I don't know if I'd put this one here. I would probably put Stargate here over this one, because that's probably his most popular Dungeon Synth album, at least from what I've seen. But either way, this release here has a similar motif as some other Mortiis releases, where it's the same song throughout, or 2 songs, or like a part 1 and a part 2, of which they're like sub parts. I don't know why Mortiis did that, because all of the songs are mixed so that they end and start a new song. Not sure why he did that, but let's actually get into like the meat and potatoes of this album. So there are a lot of summoning style like horn synths, which is a very common element in Dungeon Synth, but that sort of coats everything here. And in terms of a Dungeon Synth album, this one feels very maximalist, a very big sound, not very hypnotic, not very minimalist, heaven forbid, not that atmospheric, to be honest. And dare I say, even a bit amateurish at times. There are times where things feel like slightly before where they're supposed to be on the beat, which, if that's some music theory thing that I'm not myself familiar with, I mean, sure, I guess Mortiis does jazz, but like I don't buy it. I will say that the second of all the tracks here is pretty atmospheric and a pretty strong selection if you're trying to pick out an individual song from this album. And the second suite overall, that's my prog terms coming in here, I think is a little better. It's got a lot more flute sounds. It's still pretty maximalist, but I think just the textures overall are a bit more pleasing to the ear. So as an album overall, I'd probably give this an okay. Not super appealing so far. Not a great introduction to dungeon synth. But it is a Mortiis album, and he is considered essential by the dungeon synth community. Meanwhile, the next album we get to is Fjelltroven. I probably pronounced that wrong, but it's by Wong Raven. This is made by Satyr from Satyricon, which is a black metal band known for a really good early period and then not much after. So finding another release from the members of the band at all, at least in their early stuff, is a really fun thing to see, especially because most people consider Burzum and Mortiis as like the two main leaders of like that early dungeon synth style. It's a really refreshing change of pace to see Wong Raven here, because this release is actually quite wonderful. It's very eclectic. The sounds are very different all over. There are points where it's more like acoustic sort of neo-folk or like really old traditional Norse folk styles that are woven in. A lot of like black metal atmosphere comes through here. Really interesting and eclectic album overall that I'm really digging. The textures are excellent on the opening track, which takes up about half the time of the album. It's pretty long here, and it weaves through all these different styles with these really long, drony horn tones that actually are rather pleasing to the ear in comparison to some of the Mortiis horns that don't sound as good and a little more cheesy. And this release is very slow-paced and minimalist, in sharp contrast to that Mortiis album. We get a lot of building tension and a lot of winding paths that take you through all these different textures with all similar motifs that are woven throughout. It's really awesome. There's also spoken word here, which is a nice change of pace because, I mean, some dungeon synth albums do spoken word, but a lot of the times you kind of realize why they don't have their voice in it that much, because really it's not that good. Wong Raven here feels like a very special release, from the singing, from the fact that like Viking-isms aren't cringe is monumental, honestly. This album gets a great. I'm really enjoying it. The next album is Gothmog with Medieval Journeys. This is Gothmog's only release, which is kind of interesting because this album is really interesting as well. First off, if you listen to this, you could probably tell a lot of similarities with Summoning, at least in sort of like the progressing, like sort of like triumphant sound, which is really interesting in comparison to a lot of other sort of like black metal style dungeon synth people, where a lot of times you get a lot of like neutral emotions, some kind of creepy, some triumphant but rather cheesy sounding. Here it actually kind of takes it and runs with it in a really good direction. But also that's not the only emotion on the album here. We actually also get rather cold textures, really bitter sounds, and a lot of spite coming from this album. It's really interesting. First of all, even just from the opening track, this thing sounds icy and very resonant. Just beautiful textures, really scratches the inner part of your ear. Really nice to listen to, just pleasant sounds. The song Blood Drips From My Sword not only feels utterly massive as sort of an opening track after the introduction, but it also feels just excellent as a song overall. The textures are dark and they're eerie and they're distant. It's not overly dense. It's not overly cheesy. The song Lost in My Dreams, I'd say, hits a bit of a low on the track list because the synth line feels a bit cheesy, but honestly, the rest of the song as a whole is pretty strong. The song A View Into My Abyss is a real highlight on the track list. There's a 5/4 synth line. I don't know, they put prog in dungeon synth, and it goes off without a hitch. It doesn't feel immersion breaking. It just feels really interesting. And the fact that it's off kilter builds a lot of tension, which dungeon synth artists, I feel, don't really acknowledge this idea that much. So Gothmog's release here, because of that one synth line, I'm going to give it a good 4 now, but if you are craving more dungeon synth after covering all the greats, start with this one. Like, this is like the barrier. The next release is Ashnaz Durbatuluk by Nasgul. This is the shortest release here at just 27 minutes long, and it is probably the most nerdy release on here. This one is like almost poppy feeling in a couple ways. And I'll say, as a release as a whole, the quality of it really reveals itself later in the album as opposed to the beginning, which is kind of rare for releases in general. Just the beginning, it doesn't give you a lot to work with. The drum textures kind of drown everything out. Doesn't work. It feels a little too maximalist. The atmosphere is not really there. But as it goes on, you get a lot better songs that kind of save the release, in my opinion. To listen to this album in a way that I think you guys would enjoy. And if you are mainly familiar with the black metal style of dungeon synth, don't think of that when you go into this album. Think of it more as like maybe adventurous, maybe a little more tense, but like less icy, less folky, more plain like chiptune style synths here. And then you're going to get a lot more enjoyment out of it. When I went into it with that sort of perspective, I enjoyed it a lot more than I would have otherwise. The song Boromir's Whatever, I don't know how to pronounce that. That is probably my favorite track. It's probably the darkest here, probably the most to like the traditional dungeon synth style that I know and love myself. But I give this album a good. I think it's solid. It just takes a bit to get into. Next is Baldurs Death, or Dottie Baldurs by Burzum. This one is a little longer here. It's the first prison release from Varg at 39 minutes in length. And I will say it is not as good as Varg's better dungeon synth material, I would say. I'd say as a whole track list, maybe it's as good as like Thulean Mysteries, which came out in 2020. But I think Thulean Mysteries certainly has single power, and I say that loosely because a lot of individual songs of Thulean Mysteries are a whole lot better than this release as a whole. So the textures on this album feel a bit chiptuney, especially for Varg's like typical synth sounds. A lot of his synth sounds are known for being a lot colder, pretty icy, very atmospheric, and instantly just hooky in terms of for your ears. I don't mean like it's hooky in a pop sense. But here they feel very chiptuney, a little cheap, and pretty cheesy. It sounds like, honestly, it could soundtrack like Fire Emblem for the Game Boy. So overall, I'd say this album has a pretty spotty track list. Some of it is very strong and hypnotic, which is when it's at its strongest. Varg knows how to be hypnotic. That's like his main style that works. But the other things that try to be a little more eclectic and like interesting, I honestly don't find as appealing. I give this album an okay overall. It's certainly not bad. I found enjoyment in it. Just as an overall album, not that strong. Meanwhile, Varg's next release, whatever that is, I don't know what it's pronounced as, 33 minutes long, a lot tighter. The synths are way better, just dare I say gorgeous in a couple instances. The synths feel very icy, which is a lot more recognizable as Burzum. This actually feels like a Burzum release, like he just turned dungeon synth rather than doing whatever. Of course, some is still the massive feeling fake horn-filled synth that we know and love, I guess you could say. But just overall as a release feels a lot more consistent and concise and just better. Also, there's some folk-sounding synth bits here, which, I mean, kind of call back to maybe like Det Sammenhang Var. I probably pronounced that wrong, but that's the second Burzum full-length release. It calls back to more of the synth bits on that album. And it makes more sense, and it still sounds pretty good. Of course, sometimes it's still cheesy, but I think this album's good overall. Next, we get the first album from Mortiis, which is the 53-minute long, whatever that is. So already pretty intimidating looking album just in terms of the track length. It is one massive song in 13 sections divided amongst 2 parts, but actually it's one of Mortiis' strongest releases. It's very meditative and calming. Really interesting winding paths that the whole thing goes down. Maybe not the most active listen in the world. It is dungeon synth overall, but very atmospheric. Good for like RPGs if you play them with your friends. I totally recommend this album right here. And it has actually a motif that's really common in more modern dungeon synth, and it's this thick organ texture that is actually really appealing in dungeon synth. Normally that doesn't sound like a good idea to have like fake textures of anything. But the organ texture, I don't know what the programmers did, but they got it down pat. It sounds excellent. I think overall it's a very atmospheric listen. I actually give this a great. I think it's a very solid listen, and I think if you like the idea of dungeon synth that you guys would enjoy it. Next, we actually get Mortiis' compilation from this time, Crypt of the Wizard. This is kind of interesting because it takes all of his single releases, which for a dungeon synth artist sounds kind of whack. I mean, I don't know why you'd release singles. Maybe I'd make compilations or like demos, but like singles, really, like who's gonna be like, oh wow, 7 more minutes that I can switch a CD or tape out for when I'm playing Dungeons and Dragons with my friends. Like it's a bit bizarre. But in terms of the quality of this release, it is spotty. A lot of different styles are tackled here, which makes this unfortunately essential, because there's one song which invents comfy synth as a genre. If you've ever listened to comfy synth, this album kind of makes it. There's a part that's like kind of groovy towards like the end of the track list, which I'll include here. But the rest of the album overhaul is weak. It takes all of the issues of Mortiis' third release and just pushes them into the listener, and it's just not that good. I'd say the progression is borderline nonsensical at points, where it seems to be building towards nothing, and it just doesn't seem to go anywhere with any purpose. Like, it feels aimless, completely aimless. Like it wants to reach some kind of atmospheric peak, and yet it never goes anywhere that makes any sense. And unfortunately, this album ends our classics here. If you want to cover only larger releases and not singles, I guess you have to cover this to be essential, but I'd really just pick out the couple tracks towards the end that invent comfy synth, and there is a dungeon synth track that follows right after that I think is pretty solid too. But as an overall album, just I want to give this a poor. It's a poor. I don't really pick the names for the bad albums that I cover on these like chart releases here, but I give this a poor. Just weak. Now onto the modern works, we get this album. I don't know how to pronounce this either, but it's here. It's a Bandcamp release. It's only 27 minutes long, and I can honestly say it's a bit of a change of pace, and it's pretty good. So right off the bat, I think this is an excellent album to start us off in the modern section, because it has these sort of modern productionisms that allow for the textures to breathe a whole lot more. It allows for a lot more progression and just weaving in ideas super easily. I think just the textures are almost gorgeous on this album. Of course, it feels a bit chiptune at points, but it doesn't come across as nearly as cheesy. The song Eldaford is filled with these wind textures and some really long, drawn-out synth sounds, which reminds me of like really classic Burzum-style dungeon synth on like the black metal albums, which is actually one of the highlights on the album here. I think it's a very strong track. One of the songs is in 3/4 with a really wobbly atmosphere. It feels kind of adventure-y, which I think is a really strong addition to the album. So overall, I think this album is good. I think towards the end, there are a couple tracks that feel kind of just okay, but overall, it's good. I think it almost reaches great. So this is kind of up there with Gothmog, maybe like a little bit under. And now we get the 2011 release, Through Mist and Ruins by Ivaznar. I don't know if I got that right. But all these dungeon synth people love to have really difficult to pronounce names. So this album is long and drawn out and a bit busy, but more than anything else here, it sounds lo-fi. It's very, very like crunchy, little interesting little sounds here. I will say, of all the releases on this modern section, this is the most Muzak-y, really not that engaging as a listen. Just straight up, you don't have to cover it as much as the others here. But there are a couple highlights, such as Lake of Blood, which is a really like dark wave style, medieval style dungeon synth song that I think is pretty strong. But just to summarize it overall, inessential, kind of just okay. And okay is what I'd give it. Now, I kind of wanted to get through that album because I wanted to cover this next one here. This is Abandoned Places, and the album's called With the Dead in the Language of the Dead. Really interesting and unique atmosphere here. Certainly an isolating sound here, and texturally probably one of the most interesting albums on this whole chart from either section, because it's this really crunchy and grimy sound. It's like you're wading through like a flooded cemetery, and you're just crunching on bones, and you hear like this army in the distance. That's the feeling you get for almost the whole time here, and it feels rather apocalyptic for dungeon synth. Really interesting atmosphere here, really interesting textures overall. Of course, some songs, such as the title track, are more moody than other tracks here, so I guess you could argue that the track list is spotty, but I think it's consistent enough to merit a high level of quality. Also, if you consider dungeon synth a subgenre of dark ambient, this album really proves that that is true. I think it really accomplishes what it sets out to do, and with this really creepy vibe, really tense. It's really interesting, and I give this one a great as well. And it's an interesting change of pace. The textures are so unique. I really recommend this. If you're trying to find some essential dungeon synth, I don't know if I'd call this essential, but this artist does have like a bunch of releases, and they all seem really cool. This one, amongst like after you get through like the core dungeon synth style, this is one to cover. The next one is Hedge Wizard with More True Than Time Thought. I'll be honest, without looking at my notes here, the only real thing I can remember about this is that one of the songs feels a bit like Mortiis' third album, where the drum is like right before the beat, not quite there. I remember that a lot, which is not a good way to remember it, but the quality overall is actually pretty good. It's got this really charming croaky organ sound that we're probably going to see on the rest of the albums that I cover on this chart today. Which is really charming. It's really interesting and mystical feeling. It kind of reminds me of how a lot of black metal is like very mysterious. Like Mayhem and Burzum in particular have this mysterious style to them that not a lot of other bands actually cover. And here it seems very, very mysterious too. But this one's a lot more positive sounding. It's almost like the birth of some like spirit. I don't know. That doesn't make any sense. But I mean, if there was a vibe to that, this is what would be like that. I'd say most of these tracks go off without a hitch, even though that one track felt a bit amateurish. And on occasions, it reaches more ambient territory here, which is a very pleasing sort of sound overall. So I'd give this album a good. I think it's very strong. The next one is Lord Leviticus with Trolldom. So this album is 41 minutes long, and 7 minutes of it as a total are covers, several different covers. I don't know why you're covering songs in dungeon synth. I don't know what makes you feel like you could really provide such a unique perspective. But there's a Burzum cover. There was a Behemoth cover. I don't get it, personally. Sounds a bit weird to me. But it doesn't necessarily hurt the album that much. But the thing with the album is it's not that strong to begin with. It certainly sounds like early Burzum style with really heavy fake strings. Like fake strings are all over this album. It also sounds a lot like a video game OST, just like sort of like Baldur's Death. Really like chiptune sounding textures all over. It's kind of creepy like atmosphere. But unfortunately, like texturally, not that interesting. It doesn't really cover any new ground we haven't reached here. I still give this an okay. I still think it's fine to listen to. I just think if you want something refreshing, you're certainly not getting it here. And to end our chart here, we have Caverns of Endless by Erdstall. This album is 2 songs. Both are over 20 minutes long. And when I mentioned being experimental in dungeon synth, this is an album that does that. This really incorporates elements of drone. Because you get these super huge, like 6-minute periods of like very similar textures, and it just feels so dominating. And by Caverns of Endless, it really feels endless. It's a bit unnerving listening to this as an album here. It's not like the calming, sort of spiteful feeling of maybe like some Burzum dungeon synth or in the black metal era, but it's rather just almost scary, like a bit uncomforting at points. Texturally, there are only so many different textures on this release here, but the progression of them feels so satisfying and interesting. I can't say that much about this album because there's so much drone going on here, but the atmosphere is real, and this album overall is great. So I have a lot to say about this chart as a whole. First of all, dungeon synth, I don't consider a genre to jump into from any standpoint. My interest in dungeon synth came from black metal. As you guys know, I'm a pretty decent fan of black metal, so I think of like Burzum, or even as old as like Celtic Frost with a couple of their like dark ambient tracks. When I have an interest in dungeon synth, I don't think of it as just like out of the blue, I want to listen to some chiptune. Like that's not really what I want to cover. So in terms of like a chart overall, first of all, like Mortiis on these dungeon synth charts gets so much recognition. It's a bit ridiculous, but I mean, if you love Mortiis, I understand why you want him there. But of course, I mentioned earlier, Thief and Forgotten Pathways were kind of forgotten here. And there are some other Dungeon Synth albums out there that you could probably include that would be more interesting. That Trolldom release actually found on another chart that I'm probably going to cover another time, even though I don't find it necessarily as important as it should be. I honestly think before Dungeon Synth, you should probably include a couple black metal albums. And I know this isn't a black metal chart, but most, like, 70% of Dungeon Synth fans, I'd say, are probably interested in black metal in one way or another. I mean, that's at least what the perspective I've had is. That might sound totally uneducated to some people, but I think it's important because Burzum has better Dungeon Synth material on albums that aren't even Dungeon Synth, which is a huge important thing. Also, big thing here, I know they're demos, but there are demos on here too. Paysage d'Hiver isn't here. Paysage d'Hiver has 2 excellent Dungeon Synth albums. Of course, one you can consider Dark Ambient and not Dungeon Synth, but the one with the castle, that's Dungeon Synth, and it would probably be like top 3 to top 5 albums on this chart here. It's a quality listen. I think it could do well with an inclusion. I think it's worth, because if you think of someone that's more classic than all these Dungeon Synth people, I'd argue Paysage d'Hiver is a lot more classic, but that's about it. I think this chart's it's pretty decent. I mean, a lot of the stuff is considered essential, so I can't really knock it that hard for its quality not being the best, but it's influential nevertheless. I hope you guys enjoyed. If you guys appreciate some of these albums, I'd love to hear what you think about them in the comments. Please leave a like and a subscribe because it helps me a lot and it helps me grow my channel, and I'd love to keep making this for you guys out there, so I'd appreciate that. But that's about it. Hope you guys are doing well out there. Have a good one. Bye.